In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen. This is the day of Pentecost, the anniversary of the founding of the church. The church's birthday, so to speak. I once served a congregation where each year they celebrated Pentecost by having a birthday party during the coffee hour. And they would decorate the fellowship hall with streamers and birthday napkins and colorful cups. They had a birthday cake with candles, and it was fun. The first Pentecost was a little different. The church was born, and it wasn't quite that kind of party, but it was exciting nonetheless. Just before Jesus ascended back into heaven, he had told the disciples to wait in Jerusalem. And as he promised, you will be baptized by the Holy Spirit not many days from now. So Jesus was promising the disciples that they would receive the Holy Spirit, God's Spirit, that they would be invested with God's power. It was on this day of Pentecost that Jesus' promise came true, that the disciples were baptized with the Holy Spirit, God's Spirit. Keep in mind that the disciples were all Jews. Jesus' disciples knew the Old Testament like the back of their hands. When Jesus promised that they would be baptized with the Holy Spirit, they would remember all of the stories about God's Spirit in their scriptures, in their history. To understand those Old Testament stories, it would help for us to know the Hebrew word for spirit. The Hebrew word is ruach, which can mean spirit or breath or wind. So when Jesus promised the disciples that they would be baptized with the Holy Spirit, they would remember the Spirit, the ruach, of God hovering over the surface of the waters at the creation in Genesis. When Jesus promised his disciples that they would receive the Holy Spirit, they would remember Ezekiel and the valley full of dry bones. Bones dry as a bone, according to Ezekiel 37, that came to life as a great army when the ruach of the wind, the Spirit, blew over them. Same word. You see, Israel had lost faith. They had lost hope. The Israelites had said, our bones are dried up and our hope is lost. But God said, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves, my people. I will put my ruach, my breath, my spirit into you, and you shall live. That was God's way of assuring God's people that they had not come to the end of the line. That was God's way of telling hopeless people that they could now hope. There's an old saying, where there's life, there's hope. Where there's breath, there's hope. Where the heart is beating, there is hope. Where the body is warm, there is hope. But once there is no breath, no heartbeat, no warmth, there is no hope. There comes a point beyond which no one can help. But the story of Ezekiel and the dry bones was God's assurance that for God's people, for us, there's always hope. Always. It doesn't matter whether there's life or breath or warmth. It doesn't matter whether the bones have been lying in the ground for decades. The story of Ezekiel assures us that the Spirit of God has the power to transform hopelessness into hope, death into life. It tells us that God can breathe into us this ruach, this breath, this spirit of life, and we can live again. That's what happened on the first Pentecost. Earlier, when the disciples saw that the soldiers arrest Jesus, it kind of sucked the life out of them, sucked the wind out of them. Peter, bold Peter, brave Peter, became a coward who denied that he even knew Jesus. We don't know what happened to the rest of the disciples because they just disappeared. They faded into the woodwork. They went into hiding. The disciples started coming back to life again when they saw the risen Christ. But they really came back to life on Pentecost. The book of Acts says that the disciples were all together. And that's significant, isn't it? When the church is divided, it wastes a whole lot of its energy. But when we're all together, wonderful things happen. And then there was a sound of a violent wind, and the disciples were filled with the Holy Spirit, and they began to speak in other tongues, in other languages. Their speaking in tongues had a purpose. On that day of Pentecost, there were Jews gathered together in Jerusalem from every nation under heaven. People spoke many different languages. The Holy Spirit gave the disciples the ability to speak all of those languages all at once, so that everyone heard the gospel in their own language. You know, when you go visit a foreign country and you're around a lot of people who are speaking a foreign language, when all of a sudden your ear kind of perks up because you hear somebody speaking English, you kind of get excited. You're really glad to hear somebody speaking your own language. And that's what happened to these people. But there was another purpose as well to the disciples speaking many languages, and that purpose was to say, listen up. Listen up. This is God speaking. It doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. What you are about to hear is important, and it applies to you. Then Peter got up on his soapbox or whatever he stood on, and he began to preach. He quoted a passage from the prophet Joel, who had foretold a day when God would pour out his Spirit on all flesh. In his sermon, Peter said that that day had come. This was the day that God was pouring out his Spirit. This was the beginning of a new era. Until John the Baptist came along, there had been no prophet in Israel for close to 400 years. But at Pentecost, on Pentecost, God poured out his Spirit, not on one disciple, but on all. Pentecost was God's promise that all God's people would receive the gifts of God's Spirit. And as I so often say, that means you and me. At our baptism, we received the gift of the Holy Spirit. God lives in us, and we are God-powered. Now that may seem unlikely to you, because we, like most congregations, are pretty ordinary. Face it, we are. But so were the first apostles. They were, for the most part, ordinary dirt. If you don't believe me, let me offer you this challenge. Take out a piece of paper and a pen or pencil. If not now, then later today at some point. Then write down the names of the 12 apostles. Then write down one significant accomplishment for each of the 12 disciples. I bet you can't do it. I couldn't do it. Because most of the 12 apostles were so ordinary. I believe that Jesus chose such ordinary apostles to encourage us ordinary Christians. Those ordinary apostles changed the world because they were filled with the Holy Spirit, God's Spirit. They were God-powered. And so are we. God's Spirit lives among us, within us. God's Spirit is there in each of you right now, looking for opportunities to bless you, looking for opportunities to bless others through you. Sometimes we make it difficult for the Holy Spirit. Sometimes we get so caught up in ungodly living, or in selfish living, or angry living, or anxious living, or materialistic living, that the channels through which the Spirit wants to work are often all clogged up. But they're among us right now, here in this congregation, here in this community, in our families, people who live by faith, by prayer, by service. Those people bless us day by day. They do little things, but God's Spirit in them multiplies those little things and transforms them into blessings that bless all of us. This week, resolve to become one of those godly people. Resolve to clear the gunk out of the channels of your life so that the Spirit who dwells in you can work freely through you. Let me offer you a 3-point discipline to follow this week to make that happen. First, read one chapter of the Bible every day. One chapter. Second, spend 5 minutes in prayer each day. Just 5 minutes. Praising God, thanking God, and praying for others. Third, resolve to do at least one kind act each day. Doesn't have to be huge. It can be sending an email, making a phone call, uplifting somebody in a Facebook chat, whatever. One small kind act. It just has to be daily. If you'll do those things each day this week, you will feel the Spirit begin to come alive in you. That Spirit, God's Spirit, will begin to bless you. That Spirit will make you a blessing to your family and everyone you meet. And then the miracle of Pentecost will become a reality in your life. May God's Spirit be with you all. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.